I never thought missing a single month's rent could make my entire life feel so small. It wasn't just the money. It was the silence that followed every ignored call. The way the walls of my apartment felt closer each night, like they were waiting for me to fail. I had always paid on time before. Always been responsible. Then one bad stretch turned into another, and suddenly I was behind with no clear way out. I told myself it was temporary, that something would work out, but hope doesn't pay rent. That I lived alone, and that loneliness amplified everything. There was no one to split the worry with, no one to help shoulder the panic that settled in my chest every evening. I'd lie awake counting hours instead of sheep, calculating how many days I had before the landlord would take action. Each notification on my phone made my heart race. When his messages finally came, they were polite at first, almost understanding. He said he knew times were hard. He said he just wanted to talk. That kindness somehow made it worse, because it left me no excuse to hide behind anger that I avoided him for longer than I should have. I convinced myself that if I didn't open the door, the problem would pause. It didn't. The final message was short and direct. He wanted to meet in person to figure something out. He added that he might bring a couple of friends along, people who could help discuss options. That line stuck with me. Friends. Options. I read it over and over, trying to hear it in a neutral tone, but something about it unsettled me. Still, I agreed. What choice did I really have? Eviction felt like a cliff edge, and this meeting felt like the last narrow bridge before it. I cleaned the apartment even though it didn't matter. I straightened things that didn't need straightening. Anything to keep my hands busy and my thoughts from spiraling. I practiced what I would say, how I would explain myself without sounding desperate, without sounding weak. I promised myself I wouldn't beg. When the knock finally came, it felt heavier than it should have, like it carried more than just people on the other side. I took a breath before opening the door, reminding myself that this was just a conversation, that I was still in control of my choices. The landlord stood there, just as I remembered him, but he wasn't alone. Two men stood slightly behind him, relaxed, almost too comfortable for a rent discussion. They smiled in a way that didn't reach their eyes. The air changed the moment they stepped inside. The apartment felt smaller with them in it, and I became acutely aware of my own situation, my unpaid rent, my dependence, my vulnerability. They sat like they belonged there, like this was their space too. The landlord spoke calmly, explaining that he wanted to help me, that he didn't want things to get ugly. His friends nodded along, adding comments about how life sometimes demands flexibility, how problems can be solved in unexpected ways. As I listened, I realized this wasn't just about money anymore. There was an unspoken layer beneath every word, something heavy and uncomfortable that pressed against my chest. I felt seen in a way I hadn't asked for, evaluated not as a tenant but as a person with leverage being weighed against her worth. Part of me wanted to stand up and end it right there. Another part, quieter but stronger, reminded me of how close I was to losing everything. I told myself I would just listen, just hear them out, just survive this conversation. I didn't know then that simply staying, simply not saying no right away, was already the beginning of a line I would soon cross. Once everyone was settled, the conversation drifted in a way that felt intentional. It started with numbers, late fees, timelines, all the things I had already memorized in my head. Then the landlord leaned back and sighed, as if he were tired of pretending this was a simple transaction. He said he didn't like paperwork, didn't like courts, didn't like forcing people out when they were already struggling. His friends echoed the sentiment, talking about how rigid systems fail people and how human solutions were often better. The words sounded reasonable, but the tone beneath them felt rehearsed. One of them asked about me instead of the rent. How long I'd lived alone. Whether I had family nearby. If I had someone looking out for me. Each question felt harmless on its own, but together they formed a picture I hadn't agreed to share. I answered vaguely, careful not to give too much away, but they watched me closely, as if reading between every line. The landlord smiled in a way that suggested understanding, and that smile made my stomach tighten. He said there were alternative arrangements people sometimes made when money wasn't available. He said it casually, like it was common knowledge, like I should already understand what he meant. I waited for him to clarify, but he didn't. Instead, one of his friends joked lightly about how favors came in many forms, and how adults were free to make mutually beneficial choices. They laughed softly, not cruelly but confidently, as if the outcome was already decided. I felt heat rush to my face, a mix of embarrassment and anger. Part of me wanted to call them out, to accuse them of crossing a line, but another part froze. I kept thinking about my bank balance, about eviction notices taped to doors, about starting over with nothing. The landlord noticed my silence and softened his voice. He said no one was forcing me. He said I was in control, that they were just talking, just exploring options. The way he said it made refusal feel ungrateful. As the conversation went on, the room felt heavier, slower. Compliments slipped in between words about rent. Comments about how lonely it must be to live like I did. How strength and beauty often went unnoticed in difficult times. I hated that those words landed. I hated that being seen even like this stirred something in me. It had been a long time since anyone had paid attention to me at all. And that truth made me feel weak. I told myself I was only listening, only buying time. I reminded myself that nothing had happened. That words alone didn't mean anything. Still, I noticed how close they sat, how their voices lowered, how the landlord stopped talking like a creditor and started talking like someone offering a deal. He said this could all go away, that I could stop worrying, stop losing sleep. All I had to do was be open-minded. Inside, my thoughts clashed violently. I thought about who I believed myself to be, the lines I thought I would never cross. I also thought about survival, about how principles feel different when you're cornered. I wasn't agreeing to anything, not yet, but I also wasn't asking them to leave. When the landlord suggested we continue the conversation without rushing, I nodded before fully realizing I had. In that moment, I understood that temptation doesn't always arrive loudly. Sometimes it settles in quietly, wearing the mask of relief, waiting for you to stop resisting. The shift didn't happen all at once. There wasn't a single sentence or gesture I could point to and say, that's where everything changed. It was more like a slow slide, a series of small permissions I gave without fully admitting what they added up to. The landlord's voice grew calmer, more personal, and his friends stopped joking and started watching. The conversation lost its structure, and with it, my sense of footing. I realized I was no longer negotiating terms. I was being measured against them. He asked me directly how far behind I was, then followed it with how long it would take me to recover financially. When I answered honestly, the room went quiet. He nodded, as if confirming something he already knew. He said he could clear the balance, not delay it, not reduce it, but erase it. No paperwork. No reminders. No threats hanging over my head. The way he said it made it sound almost generous, and that was the most unsettling part of all. I asked what that would cost me, even though I already understood. Saying the words felt like admitting defeat, like acknowledging that my situation had stripped me of the right to pretend. He didn't rush his answer. He said this wasn't about money anymore, that it was about trust, discretion, and understanding between adults. He said choices like these didn't define a person unless they let them. His friends didn't interrupt. They just waited, confident in the silence they created, and that moment, my thoughts scattered. I remembered all the versions of myself I had been before this apartment, before this debt. I remembered judging people for compromises I swore I'd never make. I also remembered the nights I cried alone, the fear of being locked out, the humiliation of asking for help that never came. Those memories pressed harder than any words in the room. I felt cornered not by them, but by my own circumstances. I didn't make a dramatic decision. I didn't argue or walk away. I nodded. That small movement felt heavier than any scream. What followed was quiet and deliberate, stripped of romance and illusion. I won't pretend it felt empowering. It felt transactional, confusing, and deeply lonely, even with people around me. I focused on getting through it, on not thinking beyond the next minute, on believing that this was temporary and that I would never have to face it again. When it was over, the landlord was all business again. He confirmed the rent was settled and reminded me that discretion mattered. His friends avoided my eyes as they left, their confidence replaced by something closer to indifference. The door closed behind them, and the apartment returned to its familiar silence. Only this time it felt different, heavier, tainted by what had just happened. I stood there for a long time, unsure what to do with myself. Relief washed over me first, sharp and undeniable. The immediate danger was gone. No eviction. No notices. That relief was quickly followed by guilt, then anger, then a hollow numbness I couldn't shake. I had solved one problem by creating another, one that didn't have a clear end date or an easy explanation. That night, Lying in the same bed where I had counted worries just days before, I realized the true cost of what I'd done. The rent was paid, but something else had been taken in its place. I told myself I would move on, that I would rebuild and forget. Deep down, though, I knew this wasn't something that would fade quietly. It had marked me, and the consequences were only beginning to unfold. In the days that followed, nothing felt normal anymore. Every routine moment carried a quiet heaviness, like the air just before a storm. I found myself moving through the house carefully, almost cautiously, afraid that one wrong thought might show on my face. Nothing had physically happened, yet the emotional weight of what we shared pressed against my conscience more intensely than I imagined it would. It was no longer something I could brush away as harmless connection. We both knew it, and that knowledge changed everything. He didn't message me the next morning. At first I thought he needed space, maybe time to process the same guilt that had been lingering in my chest. But when the silence stretched through the afternoon, I realized he was waiting for me to decide what this meant. I didn't know how to decide anything. I had feelings I wasn't supposed to have, emotional closeness I wasn't allowed to admit, and a growing fear of ruining lives simply because I had been longing for something I thought I'd forgotten. Being understood. When his message finally appeared, it wasn't long or emotional. He asked if I was okay. Just that. Simple, gentle, careful. I stared at the words, feeling the pull of everything we had shared, but this time mixed with a sharp awareness of consequences. I answered honestly for the first time. I told him I wasn't okay. I told him everything felt heavier than I expected. I told him the truth scared me. He replied quickly, saying he didn't want to cause damage, that he respected me too much to let this turn into something that left scars. I believed him. He was struggling just as much as I was, and that somehow made it both harder and easier. Harder because the feelings were real, easier because neither of us wanted to be reckless with them. We agreed to create distance, even though the idea of pulling away felt like tearing something fragile that had barely had time to exist. The first day was difficult. The second day felt worse. I found myself missing the presence he offered, the steady certainty in his voice, the way he seemed to understand my unspoken thoughts. But I also understood why the distance was necessary. Wanting something didn't make it right, and losing control of emotions didn't justify acting on them. Over time, the conversations became less frequent. Not cold, not bitter, just careful, respectful, mature in a way that felt painfully responsible. He still checked on me occasionally, and I did the same, but the tone had shifted back to something safer. We both made sure of it. I didn't confess anything at home. Not because I wanted to hide, but because the feelings I had experienced taught me something I needed to learn quietly. I realized how much emotional absence can push someone toward the nearest warmth, even when they never intended to seek it. I realized that loneliness can disguise itself as strength until the right voice unmasks it. And I realized that connection, once tasted, can become harder to control than desire ever could. The story didn't end with a dramatic goodbye or a perfect resolution. It ended with awareness, with honesty to myself, with the understanding that I had been vulnerable, and he had simply appeared at the moment I felt that vulnerability most deeply. I didn't regret helping him. I regretted how easy it was to forget myself in the process. And even now, when his name crosses my mind, it comes with a quiet mix of gratitude and ache, because some people come into your life not to stay, but to show you what you've been ignoring within yourself for far too long.